Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more philosophy. Today we are diving back into the works of Georg Hegel. This is The Science of Logic. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but some people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the science of logic with part 2 of existence. We ran out of time. This is in part vocal therapy. Hopefully we can get through all of this today before my voice completely dies. So, beta, restriction, and the ought. Now, I don't know the Greek alphabet. I'm assuming that that is beta. This contradiction is indeed abstractly present by the very fact that the something is finite, or that the finite is. But something, or being, is no longer posited abstractly, but reflected into itself, and developed as being in itself, that has determination and constitution in it, or, more determinedly still, in such a way that it has a limit within it, and this limit, as constituting what is immanent to the something, and the quality of its being in itself, is finitude. It is to be seen what moments are contained in this concept of the finite something. Determination and constitution arose as sides for external reflection, but determination already contained otherness as belonging to the in itself of something. On the one side, the externality of otherness is within the something's own inwardness. On the other side, it remains as otherness distinguished from it. It is still externality as such, but in the something. But further, since otherness is determined as a limit, itself as negation of the negation, the otherness immanent to the something is posited as the connection of the two sides, and the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong. Is its reference turned back upon itself, the reference to it of its implicitly existing determination that it negates its immanent limit. The self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being, but as negation of the negation, as negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfedness, something's own limit, thus posited by it as a negative, which is at the same time essential, is not only limit as such, but restriction. But restriction is not alone in being posited as negative. The negation cuts two ways, for that which it posits as negated is limit. And limit is in general what is common to something and other, and is also the determinateness of the in itself of determination as such. This, in itself, consequently, as negative reference to its limit, which is also distinguished from it, as negative reference to itself as restriction, is the ought. In order for the limit that is in everything to be a restriction, the something must at the same time transcend it in itself, must refer to it from within as to a non-existent. The existence of something lies quietly indifferent, as it were, alongside its limit. But the something transcends its limit only insofar as it is the sublatedness of the limit. The negative in its selfedness over against it, and inasmuch as the limit is as restriction in the determination itself, the something thereby transcends itself. The ought, therefore, contains the double determination. Once, as a determination which has as in itselfness over against negation, and again, as a non-being which, as restriction, is distinguished from the determination, but is at the same time itself a determination existing in itself. The finite has thus determined itself as connecting determination and limit. In this connection, the determination is the ought and the limit is the restriction. Thus, the two are both moments of the finite, and therefore both themselves infinite, the ought as well as the restriction. But only restriction is posited as the finite. The ought is restricted only in itself, and therefore only for us. It is restricted by virtue of its reference to the limit already immanent within it, though this restriction in it is shrouded in its itselfness. For, according to its determinate being, that is, according to its determinateness, in contrast to restriction, it is posited as being in itself. Okay, so let's pause for a second just to digest, right? We've got our green lighter. It is a lighter. That is what it ought to be. That is, existence without the limitation, other than that it does the thing it is intended to do. It lights a fire. It is a lighter. It is limited in its determination by the fact that it is a green lighter, that it is this length and this width. It is limited from the ought into it itself, which is the being in itself of a green lighter, as opposed to a lighter in general. Hopefully that's a little bit clear. What ought to be is, it is a lighter, and at the same time is not. It is not the prototype or the archetype of a lighter. If it were, it wouldn't it would not be what merely ought to be. The ought has therefore a restriction, essentially. The restriction is that once it's green, it is no longer what it ought to be. The restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is a determination now posited as it is in fact, namely, at the time, only a determinateness. The being in itself of the something is thus reduced in its determination to the ought, because the very thing that constitutes the something's in itselfness is, in one and the same respect, as non-being, or again, because in the in itselfness, in the negation of the negation, the said being in itself is as one negation. What negates? A unity with the other, and this other, as qualitatively other, is the limit by virtue of which that unity is as reference to it. The restriction of the infinite is not anything external, but the finite's own determination is rather also its restriction, and this restriction is both itself and the ought. It is that which is common to both, or rather, that in which the two are identical. But further, the ought, the finite, transcends its restriction. The same determinateness, which is the negation, which is its negation, is also sublated, and is thus itself. Its limit is also not its limit. As ought something is thus elevated above its restriction, but conversely, it has its restriction only as ought. The two are indivisible. Something has a restriction insofar as it has negation in its determination. And the determination is also the being sublated of the restriction. Remark. The ought, of late, played a major role in philosophy, especially in connection with morality, but also in metaphysics in general. as the final and absolute concept of the identity of the in itself, or of self-reference, and the determinate-ness, or the limit. You can because you ought. This expression, which is supposed to say a lot, is implied in the concept of the ought. For the ought is the transcendence of restriction. Restriction is sublated in it. The in itself of the ought is thus an identical self-reference, and consequently the abstraction of being able. But, conversely, you cannot, even though you ought, is just as correct. For the restriction, as restriction, is equally implied in the ought. The one formalism of possibility has in it a reality, a qualitative otherness, that stands opposed to it, and the connection of each to the other is a contradiction, and thus cannot, or rather, an impossibility. In the ought of the transcendence of finitude, infinity begins. The ought is that which, in the subsequent development, in accordance with the said impossibility, will display itself as a progress to infinity. Regarding the form of restriction of the ought, two prejudices deserve more detailed criticism. First, much is commonly made of the restrictions of thought, of reason, and so forth, and the claim is made that it is impossible to transcend such restrictions. What is lost track of in this claim is that something is already transcended by the very fact of being determined as a restriction. For a determinateness, a limit, is determined as restriction only in opposition to its other in general, that is, in opposition to that which is without its restriction. The other of a restriction is precisely the beyond with respect to it. Stone, metal, do not transcend their restriction, for the simple fact that the restriction is not a restriction for them. However, with respect to such general propositions that are typical of the way the understanding thinks, as that it is impossible to transcend restriction, if thought will not apply itself to see what is implied in the concept, it can then be referred to actuality, where the propositions prove themselves to be completely unrealistic. Just because thought ought to be something higher than actuality, just because it ought to dwell in higher regions remote from it, and therefore be itself determined as an ought, it fails on the one hand to advance to the concept, and on the other hand it manages to be equally untrue, both in its relation to actuality and the concept. Because a stone does not think, does not even feel, its determinateness is not a restriction for it. That is, it is not in it a negation for the sensation, the representation, the thought, and so on, which it does not have. But the stone, too, is something distinguished in its determination, or its in itself, and existence, and to this extent it, too, transcends its restriction. The concept which the stone is in itself contains the identity with the other. If it is a base receptive to acids, then it is oxidizable, neutralizable, and so on. In the process of oxidation, neutralization, and so on, its restriction to being only a base is sublated. The base transcends it. Similarly, the acid transcends the restriction to being an acid. And in the acid, just as in the caustic base, the ought, the imperative to transcend their restriction, is so strong that it is only with violence that they can be kept fixed as acid and caustic base, as waterless, that is, purely non-neutral. If, however, a concrete existence contains the concept not merely as abstract in itselfness, but as a totality existing for itself, as instinct, life, sensation, representation, and so forth, it itself then brings about by itself, this transcendence and this transcending. The plant transcends the restriction of being a seed, similarly of being blossom, fruit, leaf. The seed becomes this developed plant, the blossom fades, and so forth. In the grip of hunger, thirst, and so forth, the sentient is the impulse to transcend the restriction, and it does transcend it. It feels pain, and to feel pain is the privilege of sentient nature. Pain is a negation within the sentient's self, and this negation is determined as a restriction in the sentient's feeling just because the sentient has a feeling of itself. And this self is the totality that transcends the determinateness of the negation. If the sentient did not transcend it, it would not feel it as its negation and would have no pain. But reason, thought, is not supposed to be able to transcend this restriction. Reason, which is the universal, which is for itself the beyond of particularity, as such, that is, of all particularity, only is the transcendence of restriction. To be sure, not every transcendence beyond restriction is a true liberation from it, a true affirmation. Even the ought itself is this kind of imperfect transcending, and so abstraction in general. But the mention of a totally abstract universal is sufficient to counter the equally abstract pronouncement that restriction cannot be transcended. Or again, the mention of the infinite in general is sufficient to counter the pronouncement that the finite cannot be transcended. We can recall in this context a seemingly ingenious notion of Leibniz, that if a magnet had consciousness, it would regard its pointing to the north as a determination of its will, a law of its freedom. Rather, if the magnet did have consciousness, and along with it a free will and freedom, it would be a thinking being. Consequently, space would be, for it, a universal embracing all directions, and is one direction to the north, thus a restriction rather of its freedom. Just as a plant, and just as being held fixed to one place, is a restriction for a human being, but not for a plant. The ought, for its part, is the transcending of restriction, but a transcending which is itself only finite. It therefore has its place and legitimacy in the field of finitude, where it holds in itself fixed over what is restricted, declaring it to be the norm and the essential relative to what is null. Duty is an ought directed against the particular will, against self-seeking desire and arbitrary interest. It is the ought held up before the will, capable of isolating itself from the truth because of its instability. Those who hold the ought of morality so high as to believe that by not recognizing it as the ultimate truth, morality itself would be destroyed. The brokers of reason, whose understanding takes unceasing satisfaction in being able to confront everything that there is with an ought, and consequently a would-be superior knowledge, who therefore are all the more resistant to being robbed of the ought. These do not see that, as regards the finitude of their sphere, the ought receives full recognition. But in the actual order of things, reason and law are not in such a sad state of affairs that they only ought to be. Only the abstraction of the in itself stays at this. Equally, the ought does not perpetuate itself, nor, which is the same, is finitude absolute. The philosophy of Kant and Fish hold out the ought as a resolution of the contradictions of reason, though it is rather only a standpoint that remains fixed in finitude, and therefore in contradiction. Transition of the finite into the infinite. The ought contains restriction explicitly for itself, and restriction contains the ought. The mutual connection is the finite itself, which contains them both in its self. These moments of its determination are qualitatively opposed. Restriction is determined as the negative of the ought, and the ought equally as the negative of restriction. The finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It sublates itself. It goes away and ceases to be. But this, its result, the negative of such, is its very determination, for it is the negative of the negative. So, in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. It has only become momentarily an other finite, which equally is, however, a going away as a going away over into another finite, and so forth to infinity. But if we consider the result more closely in its going away and ceasing to be, in this negation of itself, the finite has attained its being in itself. In it, it has rejoined itself. Each of its moments contain precisely this result. The ought transcends the restriction. That is, it transcends itself, but its beyond, or its other, is only restriction itself. Restriction, for its part, immediately points beyond itself to its other, and this is the ought. But this ought is the same diremption of in itselfness and determinateness as is restriction. It is the same thing. In going beyond itself, restriction thus equally rejoins itself. This identity with itself, the negation of negation, is affirmative being, is thus the other of the finite, which is supposed to have the first negation for its determinateness. This other is the infinite. C. Infinity. The infinite in its simple concept can be regarded, first of all, as a fresh definition of the absolute, as self-reference devoid of determination. It is posited as being and becoming. The forms of existence have no place in the series of determinations that can be regarded as definitions of the absolute, since the forms of that sphere are immediately posited for themselves only as determinacies, as finite in general. But the infinite is accepted unqualifiedly as absolute, since it is explicitly determined as the negation of the finite. The restrictedness to which being and becoming would somehow be susceptible, even if they do not have it or exhibit it, is thereby both explicitly referred to and denied in it. But, in fact, by just this negation, the infinite is not already free from restrictedness and finitude. It is essential to distinguish the true concept of infinity from bad infinity, the infinite of reason from the infinite of the understanding. The latter is in fact a finitized infinite, and, as we shall now discover, is wanting to maintain the infinite pure and distant from the finite. The infinite is, by that very fact, only made finite. The infinite, A, in simple determination, is the affirmation as negation of the finite. B, but is thereby in alternating determination with the infinite, and is abstract, one-sided infinite. It is the self-sublation of this infinite and of the infinite in one process. This is the true infinite. What this is saying is that once you have defined what infinity is, it is limited by the definition you have placed upon it. So you can say that the universe is ever expanding and therefore infinite, but it is ever expanding and therefore it is defined or finite by ever expanding. A. The infinite in general. The infinite is the negation of negation, the affirmative, being that has reinstated itself out of restrictedness. The infinite is, in a more intense sense than the first immediate being. It is the true being, the elevation above restriction. At the mention of the infinite, soul and spirit light up, for in the infinite, the spirit is at home, and not only abstractly. Rather, it rises to itself, to the light of its thinking, its universality, its freedom. What is first given with the concept of the infinite is this, that in its being, in its self-existence, is determined as finite and transcends restriction. It is the very nature of the finite that it transcends itself, that it negates its negation and becomes infinite. Consequently, the infinite does not stand above the finite as something ready-made by itself, as if the finite stood fixed outside or below it. Nor is it only we, or is it we only, as a subjective reason, who transcend the infinite into the infinite, who transcend the finite into the infinite. As if, in saying that the infinite is a concept of reason, and that through reason we elevate ourselves above things temporal, we did this without prejudice to the finite, without this elevation, which remains external to the finite, affecting it, insofar as the finite itself is being elevated to infinity. It is not at all an alien force that does this for it. It is rather its nature to refer itself to itself as restriction, both restriction as such and as ought, and to transcend this restriction, or rather, in this self-reference, to have negated the restriction and gone above and beyond it. It is not in the sublation of the finite in general that infinity in general comes to be, but the finite is rather just this, that through its nature it comes to be itself the infinite. Infinity is its affirmative determination, its vocation, what it truly is in itself. The finite has thus vanished into the infinite, and what is only the infinite. By this logic, right, our little green lighter is not a lighter, right? It is temporarily, finitely able to start a fire. But eventually, the butane will run out, and when I strike it, nothing will happen. Then it will become its infinite part, because there will be no more change outside of external forces. It has, for itself, become what it was always meant to be, empty. And therefore no longer defined by being a lighter, but rather infinite potential. B. Alternating determination of finite and infinite. The infinite is. In this immediacy, it is at the same time the negation of another, of the finite, and so, as existent, and at the same time as the non-being of an other, it has fallen back into the category of the something, of something determinate in general. More precisely, the infinite is the existence reflected into itself, which results from the mediating sublation of determinateness in general, and is consequently posited as existence distinct from its determinateness. Therefore, it has fallen back into the category of something with a limit. In accordance with this determinateness, the finite stands over against the infinite as real existence. They, thus, remain outside each other, standing in qualitative mutual reference. The immediate being of the infinite resurrects the being of its negation, of the finite again, which seemed at first to have vanished into the infinite. So, if we have our lighter, right, once it no longer sparks and has gone from being finite into the infinite, because it is no longer negated by being defined, it becomes part of the infinite. But it can become part of the finite again if it is repurposed. If it were possible to refill this lighter, when you refill the lighter, it would once again become finite from the infinite. But the infinite and the finite are not in these referential categories only. The two sides are further determined in addition to being as mere others to each other. Namely, the finite is restriction posited as restriction. It is existence posited with the determination that it passes over into what is its in itself and becomes infinite. Infinity is the nothing of the finite, the in itself that the latter ought to be. But it is this at the same time as reflected within itself, as realized ought, as only affirmative self-referring being. In infinity, we have the satisfaction that all determinateness, alteration, all restriction, and the ought itself, together with it, have vanished, or sublated, and the nothing of the finite is posited. As this negation of the finite is the being in itself, determined which, as negation of negation, is in itself affirmative. Yet this affirmation is qualitatively immediate self-reference, being, and because of this, the affirmative is led back to the category of being that has the finite confronting it as another. Its negative nature is posited as existent negation, and hence as first and immediate negation. The infinite is, in this way, burdened with the opposition to the finite, and this finite, as another, remains a real existence even though in its being in itself, in the infinite, it is at the same time posited as sublated. The infinite is that which is not finite. A being in the determinateness of negation, contrasted with the finite, with the series of existent determinacies of realities, the infinite is indeterminate emptiness, the beyond of the finite, whose being in itself is not in its existence, which is something determinate. As thus posited over against the infinite, against the finite, the two connected by the qualitative mutual reference of others. The infinite is to be called the bad infinite, the infinite of the understanding, for which it counts as the highest, the absolute truth. The understanding believes that it has attained satisfaction in the reconciliation of truth, while in fact entangled in unreconciled, unresolved, absolute contradictions. And it is these contradictions into which it falls on every side whenever it embarks on the application and explication of these categories that belong to it, that it must make it conscious of the fact. This contradiction is present in the very fact that the infinite remains over against the finite, with the result that there are two determinacies. There are two worlds, one infinite and one finite, and in their connection the infinite is only the limit of the finite, and thus only a determinate, itself finite infinite. This contradiction develops its content into more explicit forms. The finite is the real existence which persists as such even when it has gone over into its non-being, the infinite. As we have seen, the infinite has for its determinateness over against the infinite only the first immediate negation, just as the finite, as negated, has over against this negation only the meaning of another, and is, therefore, still a something. When, therefore, the understanding, elevating itself above this finite world, rises to what is the highest for it, to the infinite, the finite world remains for it as something on this side here, and, thus posited only above the finite, the infinite is separated from the finite, and, for the same reason, the finite from the infinite. Each is placed in a different location, the finite as existence here, and the infinite, although the being in itself of the finite, there as a beyond, at a nebulous, inaccessible distance outside which there stands, enduring, the finite. As thus separated, they are just as much essentially connected with each other through the very negation that divides them. This negation connecting them, these somethings reflected into themselves, is the common limit of each over against the other, and that, too, in such a way that each does not merely have this limit in it over against the other, but the negation is rather the in-itselfedness of each. Each thus has for itself in its separation from the other the limit in it. But the limit is the first negation. Both are thus limited, finite in themselves. Yet, as each affirmatively refers itself to itself, each is also the negation of its limit. What that means is, as long as there is butane in the lighter, it is finite. When the butane leaves the lighter, it is infinite. And therefore, the definition of the infinite is the butane not being in the lighter. Once that barrier is reached, it is separated from being a lighter to being the potential for a lighter, which is infinite. Each, thus, immediately repels the negation from itself as its non-being, and, qualitatively severed from it, posits it as another being outside it. The finite posits its non-being as this infinite, and the infinite likewise the finite. That just means that it can go back and forth between the two. It is readily conceded that the finite passes over into the infinite necessarily, that is, through its determination, and is thereby elevated to what it is in itself. For while the finite is indeed determined as subsistent existence, it is at the same time also a null in itself, and therefore destined to self-dissolution. Whereas the infinite, although burdened with negation and limit, is equally also determined as the existent in itself, so that this abstraction or self-referring affirmation is what constitutes its determination, and hence finite existence is not present in it. But it has been shown that the infinite itself attains affirmative being only by the mediation of negation, as negation of negation, and that when its affirmation thus attained is taken as just simple qualitative being, the negation contained in it is demoted to simple immediate negation, and therefore to determinateness and limit. And these, then, are excluded from the infinite as contradicting its in itself. They are posited as not belonging to it, but rather as opposed to its in itself, as the infinite. Since each is in it, and through its determination of positing of its other, the two are inseparable. But this unity rests hidden in their qualitative otherness. It is their inner unity, one that lies only at their base. The manner of appearance of this unity has thereby been defined. The unity is posited in existence as a turning over or transition of the finite into the infinite, and vice versa, so that the infinite only emerges in the infinite, in the finite, and the finite in the infinite, the other in the other. That is to say, each arises in the other independently and immediately, and their connection is only an external one, the butane. The process of their transition has the following detailed shape. We have the finite passing over into the infinite. This passing over appears as an external doing. In this emptiness beyond the finite, what arises? What is there of positive in it? On account of this, the inseparability of the infinite and the finite, or because this infinite which stands apart is self-restricted, the limit arises. The infinite has vanished, and the other, the finite, has stepped in. But this stepping in of the finite appears as an event external to the infinite. And the new limit is something that does not arise out of the infinite itself, but is likewise found given. And with this we are back at the previous determination, which has been sublated in vain. This new limit, however, is itself only something to be sublated or transcended, and so there arises again the emptiness, the nothing, in which we find again the said determination, and so forth to infinity. We have before us the alternating determination of the finite and the infinite. The finite is finite only with reference to the ought or the infinite, and the infinite is only infinite with reference to the finite. The two are inseparable and at the same time absolutely other with respect to each other, and has in it the otherness of self. Each is thus the unity of itself and its other, and in its determinateness not to be what itself and what its other is. It is existence. This alternating determination of self-negating and of negating the negating is what passes as the progress to infinity, which is accepted in so many shapes and applications as an unsurpassable ultimate, at which thought, having reached this, and so on to infinity, has usually achieved its end. This progress breaks out wherever relative determinations are pressed to the point of opposition, so that, though an inseparable unity, each is nevertheless attributed an independent existence over against the other. This progress is therefore the contradiction which is not resolved, but is rather always pronounced simply as present. What we have before us is an abstract transcending, which remains incomplete because the transcending itself has not been transcended. Before us we have the infinite. Of course, this infinite is transcended, for another limit is posited. But just because of that, only a return is instead made back to the finite. This bad infinite is in itself the same as the perpetual ought. It is indeed the negation of the finite, but in truth it is unable to free itself from it. The finite constantly resurfaces in it as its other, since this infinite only is with reference to the finite, which is its other. The same progress to infinity is therefore only repetitious monotony, the one and the same tedious alternation of this finite and infinite. The infinity of the infinite progress remains burdened by the finite as such, is thereby restricted, and is itself finite. In fact, however, it is thereby posited as the unity of the finite and the infinite. Only, this unity is not reflected upon. Yet, it alone rouses the finite in the infinite, and the infinite in the finite. It is, so to speak, the impulse driving the infinite progress. This progress is the outside of this unity, at which representation remains fixated at that perennial repetition of one and the same alternation, at the empty unrest of progression across the limit towards the infinite, which, in this infinity, finds a new limit, but is just as unable to halt at it as it is at the infinite. This infinite has the rigid determination of a beyond that cannot be attained, for the very reason that it ought not be attained, since the determinateness of the beyond of an existent negation has not been let go. In this determination, the infinite has the finite as a this side over against it, a finite that is likewise unable to raise itself up to the infinite just because it has this determination of another, that is, of an existence that perennially regenerates itself in that beyond precisely by being different from it. C. Affirmative infinity. In this reciprocal determination of the finite and the infinite alternating back and forth as just indicated, the truth of these two is already implicitly present in itself, and all that is needed is to take up what is there. This back and forth movement constitutes the external realization of the concept in which the content of the latter is posited, but externally, as a falling out of the two. All that is needed is the comparing of the two different moments in which the unity is given, which the concept itself gives. Unity of the finite and the infinite, as has often been already noted, but must especially be kept in mind at this juncture, is the uneven expression for the unity as it is in truth. But also the removal of this uneven determination must be found in the externalization of the concept that lies ahead of us. Taken in their first, only immediate determination, the infinite is the transcending of the finite, according to its determination. It is the negation of the finite. The finite, for its part, is only that which must be transcended, the negation in it of itself. And this is the infinite. In each, therefore, there is the determinateness of the other, whereas, according to the viewpoint of the infinite progression, the two should be mutually excluded and would have to follow one another only alternately. Neither can be posited and grasped without the other, the infinite without the finite without the infinite. In saying what the infinite is, namely, the negation of the finite itself is said also. It cannot be avoided in the determination of the infinite. One need only know what is being said in order to find the determination of the infinite or the finite in the infinite. Regarding the finite, it is readily conceded that it is the null. This very nothingness is, however, the infinite from which it is inseparable. Understood in this way, they may seem to be taken according to the way each refers to its other. Taken without this connecting reference, and thus joined only through an and, they subsist independently, each only an existent over against the other. We have to examine how they would be constituted in this way. The infinite, thus posited, is one of the two, but as only one of them, it is itself finite. It is not the whole, but only one side of it. It has its limit in that which stands over against it. And so, it is the finite infinite. We have before us only two finites, the finitude of the infinite, and therefore its unity with the finite, lies in the very fact that it is separated from the finite and placed, consequently, on one side. The finite, for its part, removed from the infinite and positioned for itself, is this self-reference, in which the relativity, its dependence and transitoriness are removed. It is the same self-subsistence and self-affirmation which the infinite is presumed to be. The two pathways of consideration, even though they seem at first to have each a different determinateness for their part of the point of departure, the former inasmuch as it assumes that to be only the reference of infinite and finite to each other, of each to the other, and the latter their complete separation from each other, yield one and the same result. The infinite and the finite, taken together as referring to each other in a connection which is presumed external, but is in fact essential to them. For without it, neither is what it is. Each contains its other in its own determination, just as when each is taken for itself, when looked at on its terms, each has the other present in it at its own moment. This yields, then, the scandalous unity of the finite and the infinite, the unity which is itself the infinite, that embraces both itself and the finite. The infinite, therefore, understood in a sense other than when the finite is separated from it and placed on the other side from it. Since they must now also be distinguished, each is within it, as just shown, itself the unity of both. There are thus two such unities. The common element, the unity of both determinacies, as such a unity, posits them at first as negated, for each is to be what it is in being distinguished. In their unity, therefore, they lose their qualitative nature, an important reflection for countering the incorrigible habit of representing the infinite and the finite in their unity as still holding on to the quality that they would have when taken apart from each other. Of seeing in that unity, therefore, nothing except contradiction, and not also the resolution of the contradiction by the negation of the qualitative determinateness of each. And so is the unity of the infinite and the finite, at first simple and universal, falsified. But further, since the two are now to be taken also as distinguished, the unity of the infinite, which is itself both of these moments, is determined differently in each. The infinite, determined as such, has in it the finitude, which is distinct from it. In this unity, the infinite is the in itself, while the finite is only determinateness, the limit in the infinite. But such a limit is the absolute other of the infinite, its opposite. The infinite's determination, which is the in itself as such, is corrupted by being saddled with a quality of this sort. The infinite is thus finitized infinite. Likewise, since the finite is such only the non in itself, but equally has its opposite in it by virtue of the said unity, it is elevated above its worth, and, so to speak, infinitely elevated. It is posited as the infinitized finite. Likewise, just as the simple unity of infinite and finite was falsified before by the understanding, so too is the double unity. Here, also this happens because the infinite is taken in one of the two unities, not as negated, but rather as the in itself, in which, therefore, determinateness and restriction should not be posited, for they would debase and corrupt it. Conversely, the finite is equally held fixed as not negated, although null in itself, so that, in combination with the infinite, it is elevated to what it is not, and is thereby infinitized, notwithstanding its determination, that is not vanished, but is rather perpetuated. The falsification that the understanding perpetuates with respect to the finite and the infinite, of holding their reciprocal reference fixed as qualitative differentiation, of maintaining that their determination is separate, indeed absolutely separate, comes from forgetting what, for the understanding itself, is the concept of these moments. According to this concept, the unity of the finite and the infinite is not an external bringing together of them, nor an incongruous combination that goes against their nature, one in which inherently separate and opposed terms that exist independently and are consequently incompatible, would be knotted together. Rather, each is itself this unity, and this only as a sublating of itself in which neither would have an advantage over the other in its in-itselfness and affirmative existence. As has earlier been shown, finitude is only as a transcending of itself. It is therefore within it that the infinite, the other of itself, is contained. Similarly, the infinite is only as the transcending of the finite, and therefore contains its other essentially, and it is thus within it that it is the other of itself. The finite is not sublated by the infinite as by a power present outside it. Its infinity consists rather in sublating itself. This sublating is not, consequently, alteration or otherness in general, not the sublating of something. That into which the finite is sublated is the infinite as the beginning of finitude. But the latter has long since been only existence, determined as a non-being. It is only the negation, therefore, that in the negation sublates itself. Thus, infinity is determined on its side as the negative of the finite, and thereby of determinateness in general, as an empty beyond. Its sublating of itself into the finite is a return from an empty flight, the negation of the beyond, which is inherently a negative. Present in both, therefore, is the same negation of negation, but this negation of negation is in itself self-reference, affirmation, but as turning back to itself, that is, through the mediation that the negation of negation is. These are the determinations that it is essential to bring to view. The second point, however, is that in the infinite progression they are also posited, and how they are posited therein, namely, not in their ultimate truth. First, both are negated in that progression, the infinite as well as the finite. Both are equally transcended. Second, they are also posited as distinct, one after each other, one after the other, each positive for itself. We sort out these two determinations while comparing them, just as in the comparison, in an external comparing. We have separated the two ways of considering them, the finite and the infinite, as referring to one another, and each taken for itself. The infinite progression, however, says more than this. Also posited in it, though at first still only as transition and alternation, is the connectedness of the term being distinguished. We now only need to see, in one simple reflection, what is in fact present in it. In the first place, the negation of the finite and the infinite, which is posited in the infinite progression, can be taken as simple, and hence as mutual externality, only a following of one upon the other. Starting from the finite, the limit is thus transcended, the infinite negated. We now have its beyond, the infinite, but in this the limit rises up again, so we have the transcending of the infinite. This twofold sublation is nothing, partly only an external event and an alternating of moments in general, and partly still not posited as one unity. Each of these moves beyond is an independent starting point, a fresh act, so that the two fall apart. But, in addition, their connection is also present in the infinite progression. The finite comes first, then there's a transcending of it, and this negative, or this beyond of the finite, is the infinite. Third, this negation is transcended in turn. A new limit comes up, a finite again. This is the complete self-closing movement that has arrived at that which made the beginning. What emerges is the same as that from which the departure was made. That is, the finite is restored. The latter has therefore rejoined itself in its beyond, has only found itself again. The same is the case regarding the infinite. In the infinite, in the beyond of the limit, only a new limit arises which has the same fate, namely, that as infinite it must be negated. Thus, what is again at hand is the same infinite that just now disappeared in the new limit, by being sublated, by traversing the new limit. The infinite has not, therefore, advanced one jot further. It has distanced itself neither from the finite, for the finite is just this, to pass over into the infinite, nor from itself, for it has arrived at itself. Thus, the finite and the infinite are both this movement of each returning to itself through its negation. They are only as implicit mediation, and the affirmative of each contains the negative of each, and is the negation of the negation. They are thus a result, and, as such, not in the determination that they had at the beginning. Neither is the finite an existence on its side, nor the infinite an existence or a being in itself beyond that existence. That is, beyond existence and determination of the finitude. The understanding strongly resists the unity of the finite and the infinite only because it presupposes restriction and finitude to remain, like being in itself constants. It thereby overlooks the negation of both, which is in fact present in the infinite progression, just as it equally overlooks that the two occur in this progression only as moments of a whole. That each emerges only through the mediation of its opposite, but essentially equally by means of the sublation of its opposite. If this imminent turning back has for the moment been reckoned to be just as much the turning back of the finite to itself and of the infinite to itself, noticeable in this very result is an error connected with the one-sidedness just criticized. The finite, and then the infinite, is each taken as the starting point, and only in this way two results ensue. But it is a matter of total indifference which is taken as the starting point, and, with this, the distinction caused by the duality of results dissolves of itself. This is likewise posited in the line of the infinite progression, open-ended on both sides, wherein each of the moments recurs in equal alternation, and it is totally extraneous at which position the progression is arrested and taken as beginning. The moments are distinguished in the progression, but each is equally only moment of the other. Since both the finite and the infinite are themselves moments of the progress, they are jointly the finite, and since they are equally jointly negated in it and in the result, this result, as the negation of their joint finitude, is called truth with infinite. Their distinction is thus the double meaning which both have. The finite has the double meaning, first, of being the finite over against the infinite, which stands over against it, and, second, at being, at the same time, the finite and the infinite over against the infinite. Also, the infinite has the double meaning of being one of the two moments. It is then the bad infinite. And of being the infinite in which the two moments, itself and the other, are only moments. Therefore, as in fact we now have it, the nature of the infinite is that it is the process in which it lowers itself to be only one of its determinations over against the infinite, and therefore itself only one of the finites, and elevates this distinction of itself and itself to be self-affirmation, and, through this mediation, the true infinite. This determination of the true infinite cannot be captured in the already criticized formula of a unity of the finite and the infinite. Unity is abstract, motionless self-sameness, and the moments are likewise unmoved beings. But, like both its moments, the infinite is rather essentially only as becoming, though a becoming now further determined in its moments. Becoming has, for its determinations, first, abstract being and nothing. As alteration, it has existence, something, and other. Now, as infinite, it has finite and infinite, these two themselves as in becoming. This infinite, as being turned back unto itself, as reference of itself to itself, is being, but not indeterminate abstract being, for it is posited as negating the negation. Consequently, it is also the existence or there-ness, for it contains negation in general and consequently determinateness. It is, and is there, present, before us. Only the bad infinite is the beyond, since it is only the negation of the finite, posited as real and as such. It is abstract first negation, thus determined only as negative. It does not have the affirmation of existence in it. Held fast only as something negative, it ought not to be there. It ought to be unattainable. However, to be thus unattainable is not its grandeur, but rather its defect, which is at the bottom the result of holding fast to the infinite as such, as existent. It is the untrue which is the unattainable, and what must be recognized is that such an infinite is the untrue. The image of the progression in infinity is the straight line. The infinite is only at the two limits of this line, and always only is where the latter, which is existence, is not, but transcends itself in its non-existence, that is, in the indeterminate. As true infinite bent back upon itself, its image becomes a circle, the line that has reached itself, closed and wholly present, without beginning and end. True infinity, thus taken in general as existence posited as affirmative in contrast to abstract negation, is reality in a higher sense than it was earlier as simply determined. It has now obtained a concrete content. It is not the finite which is the real, but rather the infinite. Thus, reality is further determined as essence, concept, idea, and so forth. In connection with the more concrete, it is, however, superfluous to repeat such earlier and more abstract categories as reality, and to use them for determinations more concrete than they are by themselves. Such a repetition, as when it is said that essence or that the concept is real, has its origin in the fact that to uneducated thought, the most abstract categories such as being, existence, reality, finitude are the most familiar. The more immediate occasion, however, for recalling here the categories of reality is that the negation, against which reality is the affirmative, is here the negation of negation, and consequently itself posited over against that reality which finite existence is. Negation is thus determined as ideality. The idealized is the infinite, as it is in the true infinite, as a determination, a content, a distinct but not a subsistent existent, a moment rather. Ideality has this more concrete signification, which is not fully expressed through the negation of finite existence. As regards reality and ideality, the opposition of finite and infinite is, however, so grasped that when the finite assumes the value of the real, whereas the infinite of that of the idealized. In the same way, further on, also the concept is regarded as an idealization, that is, as a mere idealization, in contrast to existence in general, which is regarded as the real. When contrasted in this way, it is, of course, of no use to have reserved for the said concrete determination of negation the distinctive expression of idealization. In that, the opposition of finite and infinite, we are back to the one-sidedness of the abstract negative characteristic of the bad infinite, and still fixed in the affirmative existence to the finite. Transition. Ideality can be called the quality of the infinite, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition, like the transition of becoming into existence. We must now explicate this transition, this imminent turning back, as the sublating of finitude, that is, of finitude as such, and equally of the negative finitude that only stands opposite to it. It is only negative finitude, is self-reference, being. Since there is negation in this being, the latter is existence. But, further, since the negation is essentially negation of the negation, self-referring negation, it is the existence that carries the name of being for itself. Remark 1. The infinite, in the usual sense of the bad infinite, and the progression to infinity, such as the ought, are the expressions of a contradiction that pretends to be itself a solution and an ultimate. This infinite is in a first elevation of sense, representation above the finite to thought, but to a thought which, for content, has only a nothing, that is, a non-existent explicitly posited as such. It is a flight beyond restrictions that fails to gather itself together within and is unable to bring the negative back to the positive. This unfulfilled reflection has before it both the determinations of the true infinite, namely, the opposition of the finite and the infinite, and the unity of the finite and the infinite, but fails to bring the two thoughts together. The thoughts of one unavoidably bring the other along, but this reflection lets them only alternate. The spectacle of this alternation, this infinite progression, occurs whenever one remains fixated on the contradiction of the unity of two determinations and of their opposition. The finite is a sublation of itself. It holds its negation, the infinity, in itself, unity of the two. It is the movement beyond the finite into the infinite, as the beyond of the finite, separation of the two. But over and beyond the infinite there is another finite. The beyond, the infinite, holds finitude, unity of the two. But this finite is also a negative of the infinite, separation of the two, and so forth. Thus, in the relation of causality, cause and effect are inseparable. A cause that would have no effect is not a cause, just as an effect that had no cause would no longer be an effect. This relation yields, therefore, the infinite progression of causes and effects. Something is determined as cause, but as something finite, and it is finite just because of its separation from the effect. It has itself a cause. That is, it is also effect. Consequently, the same thing that was determined as cause is also determined as effect, unity of cause and effect. What is now determined as effect has in turn a cause. That is, the cause is to be separated from its effect and to be posited as a different something. This new cause is, however, itself only an effect, unity of cause and effect. It has another for its cause, separation of the two determinations, and so forth into infinity. Okay, here's a visualization once again with our pretty green lighter. When I turn the wheel, that is a cause. The effect is there is a spark. When I create the spark, the spark becomes the cause of the fire, but it is an effect of turning the wheel. When the spark hits the fire and creates the fire, it becomes the effect of the fire being, but it is caused by the spark, which in turn causes a fire, which in turn consumes oxygen, which in turn has an effect on something else. So the separation of cause from effect is not something that you can really do. It is much like infinity and finitude. Once you have placed the limit upon it, it becomes the thing it was. So once you have placed that infinity is expanding, that is putting a limit on infinity, expanding. We can thus restate the progression in this more appropriate form. The claim is made that the finite and infinity are one unity. This is a false claim that needs correction by its opposite. The two are absolutely different and opposed. This claim is, in turn, to be corrected to the effect that the two are inseparable, that in one determination there lies the other by virtue of the claim to unity, and so forth to infinity. It is easy enough to see into the nature of the infinite. One must recognize that the infinite progression, the developed infinity of the understanding, is constituted by the alternation of the two determinations, of the unity and the separation of the two moments, and then further recognize that this unity and the separation are inseparable. The resolution of this contradiction is not the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This would only be another shape of the still abiding contradiction, but the ideality of the both, in the sense that in their distinction as reciprocal negations, they are only moments. That monotonous alternation of the infinite progression is in fact the negation of both their unity and their separation. What was demonstrated above is just as much present in it de facto, namely, that the finite, over and beyond itself, falls into the infinite, but that, over and beyond this infinite, it equally finds itself born anew, hence, that it rejoins itself there, as is also the case for the infinite. So that this same negation of negation results in affirmation, a result that thereby proves itself to be the truth and point of origin. In this being, which is thus the ideality of the distinct moments, the contradiction has not vanished abstractly, but is resolved and reconciled. And the thoughts, while left intact, are also brought together. Here we have, in a graphic example, the nature of speculative thought displayed in its determining feature. It consists solely in grasping the opposed moments in their unity, inasmuch as each moment shows, as a matter of fact, that it has its opposite in it, and that in this opposite it rejoins itself. The affirmative truth is this internally self-moving unity, the grasping together of both thoughts, their infinity, the reference to oneself, which is not immediate but infinite. The essence of philosophy has often been located by those already adept in the things of thought in the task of answering the question, how does the infinite go forth out of itself and become to finitude? This, as opinion would have it, escapes conceptual comprehension. In the course of this exposition, the infinite, at whose concept we have arrived, will further determine itself, and the desideratum how the infinite, if one can so express himself, comes to finitude, will be manifested in it in the full manifold of forms. Here, we are considering this question only in its immediacy and in view of the just mentioned sense which the infinite usually carries. It is, above all, on the answer to this question that whether there is a philosophy is taken to depend, and people believe, while still professing willingness to let the matter rest on it, that they also possess in the question itself a sort of puzzle, an invincible talisman, that firmly secures them against the answer, and consequently against philosophy and the attainment of it. In order to understand questions, a certain education is required also in other subject matters, and this is all the more the case for things philosophical, if more of the answer of an answer is to be had than that the question is an idle one. It is fair to expect in these questions, as is normally done, that the point at issue would not depend on words, but would rather be made intelligible through some form or other of expression. Figurative expressions of sense representation that are used in question regarding the infinite, like going forth and such like, arouse the suspicion that the question stemmed from the terrain of vulgar representation, and that the answer is also expected to be in representations current in everyday life and in the shape of a sensuous simile. Again, the green lighter, being taken in general instead of the infinite. The determining of it, its having a negation or finitude in it, seems easier to comprehend. Being is indeed the indeterminate, but it is not immediately said in it that it is the opposite of anything determinate. The infinite, on the contrary, contains this note expressly. It is the non-finite. The unity of the finite and the infinite thus appears excluded from the start. Incomplete reflection is most stubbornly opposed to this unity for precisely this reason. But see, the thing is that both are infinite, right? Even when potentiality is realized, it is still part of the infinite. It is just a slightly differentiated part. And here is an exercise to illustrate this. You are surrounded by the miasma of plasma. That is my speculation. You don't have to necessarily agree with it. To me, plasma is every single atom in existence unified, all of it, infinitely, all the way beyond the conception of the limitation, the only limitation being that it is made up of these individualized pieces. So, the air by which you are surrounded is part of the plasma, which is all of creation at once. But also, at the exact same time, you are an expression of that plasma. You are made up of individual atoms. There is carbon inside of you, oxygen, nitrogen, helium. All of them are represented in some form or another. And so, you are at the same time separated from the atmosphere and part of the atmosphere, because you contain the molecules that are exactly the same as the molecules outside of yourself. The only differentiation being the particular corporation. So, if you conceptualize this as the spirit, the plasma, being everything, and you being a representation of everything, but separated from everything, if you were to go and hold your breath, you are differentiating the atmosphere as a piece of you. It is now separated from the everything of the outside, but it is still constituted of the everything outside. The limitation being placed is an arbitrary one. It's me holding my breath. I am actually part of the atmosphere. And so me arbitrarily holding my breath differentiates the infinite from the infinite, but in a finite way. Hopefully, that's a little bit clear. I think we got it, right? All right. Take being in general instead of the infinite, the determining of it. Its having negation or finitude in it seems easier to comprehend. Being is indeed the indeterminate, but it is not immediately said in it that it is the opposite of anything determinate. The finite, the infinite, on the contrary, contains this note expressly. It is the non-void to that. Okay. But it has been shown, and it is immediately evident, without expanding further on the determination of the finite and the infinite, that the infinite, in the sense in which it is taken by that incomplete reflection, namely, as standing opposite the finite, has its other in it precisely because it stands opposed to it, and therefore already limited and itself finite. It is the bad infinite. The answer to this question, how does the infinite become finite, is therefore this. There is not an infinite which is infinite beforehand, and only afterwards does it find it necessary to become finite, to go forth into finitude. The infinite is rather for itself just as much finite as infinite, inasmuch as the question assumes that the infinite is by itself on the one side, and that the finite which has gone forth from it, or from whatever it might have come, into the divide is truly real, as thus separated from the infinite. One should say rather that it is this divide which is conceptually incomprehensible. Neither such a finite nor such an infinite has truth. That which has no truth, however, cannot be conceptually grasped. Yet it must be granted that they are conceptually comprehensible. To consider them, even as they are in representation with the determination of each implicit in the other, to have simple insight into this inseparability which is theirs, means that we comprehend them conceptually. This inseparability is their concept. In the self-subsistence of that infinite and finite, the question sets up the false content instead. It presupposes a false connection between them. For this reason, the question is not to be answered, but the false presuppositions contained in it, in effect the question itself, are rather to be denied. By thus questioning the truth of such finite and infinite, the standpoint is altered, and this change will turn the embarrassment which the question was supposed to cause back on the question itself. To the reflection from which the question originated, our own question is something new, for that reflecting lacks the speculative interest that would lead it to ascertain for its own sake, and before it draws connections between determinations, whether such determinations are anything true as presupposed. To the extent, however, that the untruth of that abstract infinite is recognized, and of the finite which is equally supposed to stand unmoved on its side, there is this to be said of the procession of the finite out of the infinite. The infinite goes out of itself into the finite, because in the way it is grasped as abstract unity, it has no truth in it, no standing, and conversely, the finite goes forth into the infinite for the same reason. Or, it is rather to be said that the infinite proceeded to finitude from all eternity, that just as much as pure being, it absolutely is not by itself alone, without having its other in it. The question, how the infinite proceeds to the finite, can harbor a further presupposition still, namely, that the infinite includes the finite within itself, and, consequently, that it is the unity of itself and its other, so that the difficulty has to do essentially with the separating, for this is in opposition to the presupposed unity. On this presupposition, the opposition insisted upon only assumes a different form. The unity and the distinguishing are separated from each other and held isolated. If, however, the unity is not taken abstractly and indeterminately, but rather, as in the presupposition, as the determinate unity of the finite and the infinite, the distinguishing of these two is also present in it. And this distinguishing is not one that would also let them get loose, each subsisting separately, but it rather leaves them in the unity as idealized. This unity of the infinite and the finite, and the distinguishing of them, are inseparable, in the same way as the finite and the infinite. Remark 2. The claim that the finite is an idealization defines idealism. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than the recognition that the finite is not truly an existent. Every philosophy is essentially idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle, and the question then is only how far this principle is carried out. This applies to philosophy just as much as to religion, for religion also, no less than philosophy, will not admit finitude as a true being, an ultimate and absolute, or as something non-posited, uncreated, eternal. The opposition between idealistic and realistic philosophy is therefore without meaning. A philosophy that attributes to finite existence, as such, true, ultimate, absolute being, does not deserve the name of philosophy. The principles of ancient as well as more recent philosophies, whether water, matter, or atoms, are universals, idealizations, not things as given immediately, that is, in sensuous singularity. Not even the water of Thales is that, for, although also empirical water, it is, besides that, the in itself, or essence, of all other things, and these things do not stand in their own, self-grounded, but they are posited on the basis of another, of water, that is, they are idealized, and thus calling the principle, or the universal, an idealization, as we have just done, and the concept, the idea, spirit, deserve the name even more. And in saying, then, that the singular things of the senses are idealizations in principle, or in their concept, and even more so when sublated in the spirit, we must note, in passing, the same double-sidedness that transpired in the infinite, namely, that an idealization is on the one hand something concrete, a true existent, but, on the other hand, that its moments are no less idealizations sublated in it. In fact, however, there is only one concrete whole from which the moments are inseparable. By an idealization is normally meant the form of representation. Whatever is in any of my representations, whether in the concept, the idea, the imagination, and so forth, goes by the name idealization, so that the idealized stands, in general, also, for imaginary constructs, for representations that are not only distinguished from anything real, but should essentially not be taken as real. In point of fact, spirit is above all true idealist. In spirit, even as spirit senses and represents, but still more as it thinks and conceptualizes, the content is not real existence, as so called. In the simplicity of the I, any such external being is only sublated. It is for me, it is in me idealized. This subjective idealism, whether it is the unconscious idealism of consciousness in general, or is consciously declared and instilled as principle, extends only to the form of representation according to which a content is mine. In the systemized idealism of subjectivity, this form is declared to be the only true form, one that excludes the form of the objectivity or reality of that content, of its external existence. Such an idealism is formal, since it does not take into consideration the content of representation or thought, therefore does not go past its finitude. Nothing is lost by this idealism, both because the reality of this infinite content, the existence filled with finitude, is retained, and because, if one abstracts from it in itself, nothing of much consequence is to be made of it, nor is anything gained by it, for the same reason that nothing is lost, since the I remains representation, spirit still filled with the same content of finitude. The opposition of the forms of subjectivity and objectivity is, of course, itself one of finitudes, but the content, as taken up in sensation, intuition, and also in the more abstract element of representation in thought, contains such finitudes in full, and these, by the exclusion of that one mode of finitude alone, of the form of subjective and objective, are still not done away with, and even less have they fallen off on their own. And that is going to bring us to the end of Chapter 2, Existence. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. This is an interesting exercise, right? The argument between realism and idealism is thousands of years old. Jung conceptualized the archetypes as the idealized persona of a person, right? So if you were a warrior, you're out there fighting battles. And if you were a father, you're at home being paternal. And if you are a mother, you are giving birth. And these generalized conceptions of perfected existence. Now, nobody is going to be the perfect representation of that. There is always going to be the real inside of the ideal. And that is really what's being said here, right? You can conceptualize yourself as the father, but sometimes you have to be the warrior too. And sometimes you have to be the peacemaker. Sometimes all of the different pieces are contained within you. That's infinity realized. By setting the definitions, you are limiting infinity. So infinity is, by itself, no limitations whatsoever. Even the conceptualization that it has no limitations is placing a limit upon it, and that is therefore outside of infinity. That's what's basically being said in this entire section here. You hold differentiation from the infinite. We did that with the breath exercise. Holding the breath doesn't change, well, it does kind of change what the content of the air is, right? I'm absorbing oxygen and I'm depositing carbon, so I am affecting the makeup, but when I express that back out, it rejoins the infinite seamlessly. There is no differentiation between my breath and the surrounding air unless it's cold and there's condensation, right? Unless you are staring at it through a thermolocation device and you see the breath come out. Then there's a little bit of differentiation, but it again fades away into the infinity of what the possibilities could be. The distinction between what is and what could be is an important one to make, right? What the idealized form of something gives us something to strive towards, even if we will never achieve it. I want to be the Father, therefore I want to be the best representation of the Father possible. But I'll never get there. I'm going to make mistakes. That is realism. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated in the video. Drop it in the comments down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you have another work you would like to see me discuss in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the box down below. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks or even the membership. The bills don't pay themselves. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.